the popular way currently of talking about trauma is thinking about it as an experience of the individual inside of their households. The thing is, globally, that's not the case. There have been these conversations. In fact, in many parts of probably mostly the global South, people start there. When the concept of trauma began to expand, they started with genocide, war, displacement. Then there came around 2015, but before that, like maybe 2010-ish, no, even before that, like in the 2000s, where people started noticing that the Western and American conversation about trauma was like, why are they only talking about events that happen to people, individual people? Like, where's all this other stuff? Meanwhile, here in the States, people who have had who have studied race and culture and those kinds of issues also noticed it, but they have yet to see that those two conversations are happening together. So I see in the American context, people struggling and reckon like this doesn't do it for me. Trauma is not just individual. If you visit our website, you already know I'm Donielle Prince, and I'm an advisor to TEND, and I'll be supporting, especially on these kinds of topics like we're gonna cover today. We'll just go ahead and get started. There's a little bit of time. I have a little bit of interactive activity, just a little. So you were attracted here by the title. What does sociocultural trauma have to do with the workplace? So I'm going to do my best to answer that for and with you. We will cover, I'm going to start us off with a very brief mindful moment, and I'll get into a definition. It's good. Sociocultural is not a term that just flows out of the mouth, or is also commonly understood. And in fact, I feel like it is still being defined and redefined all the time. So it helps to know where we're coming from today. And then I have this section just on individual versus structural axes, which is kind of a mouthful, and I'll explain more when we get there. But just, I want to talk about a turn from looking at trauma as an experience of the individual and more of it as solely, because it is an experience of the individual also, but more as a turn of toward understanding it as something that can happen outside of the household and outside of the individual, but come from structures. And then some suggestions around how do we address this in the workplace, because something like sociocultural trauma sounds like it belongs in a philosophy class, but it does have relevance to our workplaces. And so we'll talk a little bit about how that is the case. And we'll end with some suggestions and information about services that TEND can offer. So our mindful moment is something that's kind of new to me, and it may be new to you, or you may be familiar with. I've been doing Qigong, and there's this, I wish I remembered the title. I'm gonna, before these slides go out, I'll update the references. And so I'll put the link to this YouTube series that I've been watching on Qigong. And there's this wonderful exercise that I don't even know if it has a name, but what you do is you rub your hands together, and I guess it's creating chi. And then you place your hands over your eyes. Your goal is covering your eyes, and you leave them there. You leave I shouldn't do it because I'm muffling my mouth, but you leave them there for a moment, and um and then when you're ready, you can take your hands off. It's not necessarily lengthy, but it can be if it feels good. And the idea is when we're doing the exercise, the instructor says, giving your eyes a rest. And I thought, that's really good, spending a lot of time looking at screens. But also, in my background, I am a counselor, and I do both counseling and mental health education. And one of the things that you can work with people on in counseling, kind of to bring them back into their body, are any number of activities that literally bring their attention to their body. And so when I did this exercise, it's like, oh, this is a great exercise for that, because I'm always looking for things that are simple, don't require a lot of instruction, and can be done anywhere. Because that's something that people can do and then they can move on. And it just kind of reminds you, when you touch yourself, it reminds you that you're here. So if your thoughts are getting overrun or your emotions are getting overrun, just touching your body sometimes can just kind of bring you back and bring you out of that and into your present moment. And so that was a new one for me, but I already am ready to adapt it. So now you have, if you haven't done that before, you have a new one in your toolbox. All right, so this is a fairly familiar slide because I took it from Bree and from her presentation last week, but it helps to set up the definition of sociocultural trauma. So it's from SAMHSA, and it's really focused on event or series of events experienced by the individual that has harmful or life-threatening and lasting adverse effects on an individual's functioning in all the ways that are listed. And so, and that's, that's the SAMHSA definition, and there's several from different sources, but they align. There's one from the American Psychiatric Association that is pretty similar. When you look into the actual DSM-5, it's really lengthy. It's how it describes all the possible things that could be trauma, but it really can be summarized the way it is here with SAMHSA. SAMHSA is also contributing to this definition of sociocultural trauma. As you see on your screen, it's a form of trauma that's not often talked about. I really appreciated that being raised, but is experienced daily by marginalized and oppressed people. The impact of toxic stress on people living with unresolved trauma has been observed to trigger a trauma response of either fight, flight, or freeze. So similar to individual trauma or trauma that's experienced individually. And this definition comes from a resource from SAMHSA. SAMHSA has, and for those that don't know, just in case, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, federal agency, has these mental health technology transfer centers, and they're regional. And so the Great Lakes Mental Health Technology Transfer Center created this a teaching around sociocultural trauma. It has some other pieces to it, but I was like, that's a great definition to get us going. And what you see here, which may not, I took a screenshot of this. I don't have a better image, so I think it's a little hard to see, and I apologize for that. If I do this again, maybe I'll create my own. But this is a identity wheel, and it has several different identities, and we're actually going to do an exercise related to this. So I hope everyone is able to participate and then kind of write their thoughts in the chat. I have a form for you to fill out because you'll see it's a little involved. And you want to think about, it'll have each of, I think down the, in, what is that column? On the side, it'll have all of the identities, and then across, you can check the identities, and you can check more than one. So identities you think about most often, identities you think about the least often, your own identities that you would like to learn more about, identities that have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself, and identities that have the greatest effect on how others perceive you. And what I'm going to do is take you to the form, and you can also type that bit.ly directly, and I can also put in the chat if I didn't mess it up. Oh, there we go. You can click directly on that link and it'll take you to the form. And it's just for you to be able to look at and think through those 5 questions about those, I don't know, 10 to 12 identities. I've actually done this many times, and it always kind of stuns me that many of the others are ones that I don't think about. And I have some ideas about why that is, but I wonder, what did anything surprise you about what you marked? And feel free to add that to the chat. And the question was, did anything surprise you about what you noticed? And like I'm surprised because there are other issues on there, but I don't tend to think about gender, which surprises me. And that because I think of myself as a feminist who thinks a lot about feminist issues, and when I really reflect on it, I don't think about it at all. So yeah, and so I'll just say the reason I included this activity is something I actually focus on. I do a regular webinar, I guess. It's like a kind of a workshop session specifically with counselors. They're the audience for it. And so we talk about how do you, some of the things we're talking about today, but how do you address those things in a counseling session in that particular type of workplace? So, and so I include that here because it helps us expand our idea of what sociocultural is, that part of the question that brings us here today. So, and because sometimes it's hard to just kind of conjure that up, like what are the identities? And these are not all the identities. I always ask the question, if you notice anything that should be there, please put it in the chat, because I'll try to I want to try to make this, not just take a copy of it, but make this myself, and then I can add. But someone shared body size should be one that gets added there. And so I will try to make that happen. So if you think of anything else, please share. Oops. Okay. And so moving into sociocultural trauma, one of the key, I'm going to talk more about this individual versus structural, or individual towards structural turn. But the important thing to keep in mind about sociocultural trauma is that, yes, it's historical, but it's also present. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some very recent research on the concept of status from Stanford researchers Cecilia Ridgway and Hazel Marcus, that help us understand that we're going to talk about the sources of sociocultural trauma, but these behaviors that end up creating inclusion and exclusion of others are kind of automatic. They operate automatically, and there is no such thing as being socialized in this society and many others, and not having adopted these, kind of unconsciously adopted these belief systems. And so that means our task when we're trying to address it in settings within ourselves is just personal development, but also within settings where we're working with people, with diverse groups of people, we have to actively challenge them. We have to not just challenge them, we have to actively identify, acknowledge, and then work through. There is no, I don't think anyone says this anymore, but there is no, I don't see color. There's you're in a society. It's like being in an ocean, you're wet. And so you have to you have to, that's the first and most important step, is to recognize that we're all swimming in that. And so you have to go through a process very intentionally. And so, they use the term, these sociocultural, they're a social psychologist and a sociologist, so they say schemas, but sociocultural schemas of rules that are unquestioned common knowledge assumptions that govern how to place value on other people based on the identities that we just talked about. So, and I have a little bit more from this piece. I will also share. I meant to put the reference on the slide, but I have a reference slide with there if you want to check this out, and it's free. You can get this article. There's a link you can click and download it for free. And so just a few more, I have some pullouts of some other pieces of this kind of long article, but they kind of make a point that will frame the remainder of our discussion. So the status of people's group identities affects how they are treated by others in all aspects of their lives, including the institutional context such as work, school, and health organizations that are consequential for their life outcomes. And as I noted, I added that emphasis because this, if you're familiar, and I think most of the people who are attracted to this session are, with a lot of the kind of fundamentals of understanding trauma and toxic stress, that should really stand out to you, consequential for a lifetime. And let's see. Oh, and I see, I'm just checking the chat really quick because I noticed it. Generation. Yeah. More than age, generation, for that previous slide about identity. Another piece that comes out of this article is that status is best understood as a sociocultural schema or blueprint for organizing social relations to manage this basic tension, which they mean kind of competition for resources, and produce collective outcomes. And so this is kind of an emphasis on the point, if you're in the ocean, you're wet. You have to consciously, you have to say, oh, I'm in the ocean, I want to be dry, I'm going to walk out. You have to go on a journey. It's, in other words, it's fundamental. And in other words, the inequality embedded in society's status beliefs about people's significant group identities is delivered home, that's just their language, folksy language, is delivered home to the individual and shapes their life outcomes at the level of what people do every day in their work-oriented relations with one another. And in this particular passage, they were talking about the workplace, and because they kind of talk about some different settings. And so I just highlight that, obviously, because we're concerned with the workplace. And this is just more emphasis that it's there. So it doesn't just go away. We have to actively work on it. And then in their review of the research, experiments show that people form shared status beliefs about the indicators of worthiness and competence quite easily and act on these newly formed status beliefs and their subsequent treatment of people. So essentially, they're just saying we have socialization in our society around groups of people being more worthy and more competent, and other groups being less worthy and less competent. And that is just kind of a fact of American life. And then there's, which is I also found very interesting, the norms around these beliefs can be recognized not just by their enactment, but also by their enforcement. So despite their being somewhat unconscious and automatic, people will actually act to protect them very defensively. We see evidence that people enforce the basic status norms with sanctions against violators and do so spontaneously. I remember an experience I had. I used to do a lot of research in schools, and there was this school in Palo Alto, California, which isn't known for, that town is not necessarily, it's definitely not hipster Berkeley. It's but this particular school, they did a lot of they had an interesting curriculum that was very diverse. I mean, most of the population at that school was white, and it was an elementary school. But they were doing a lot of progressive things. And then there was the suggestion made that a nearby town, East Palo Alto, just, I don't know, 1.5 miles away, that was mostly African-American, Latino, and Asian Pacific Islander. The schools were in bad shape, and giving kids an opportunity to go to schools in Palo Alto, including this school. And I witnessed the most corrosive behavior from these progressive people who had been like embracing like just saying they had really been embodying the idea that, understanding diversity is an important thing. But when their resource was challenged, they spontaneously began talking about these kids will bring down our grades and the quality of our education. And it was just, I already had a lot of education around how sociocultural factors operate, not necessarily from this perspective of trauma, but I still was very stunned by that. And so this I really resonated with this piece of the research. Oh yeah, the blue-eyed experiment. I see Gail Marie is sharing about that. So all of this to say, we cannot avoid that. We have to, in whatever setting that we enter, we have to do work that's intentional to um, move forward, because we can, even in this piece, I talk about how we can undermine that just by becoming aware of it. But what we can't do is ignore it. Okay. And so I'm going to let James Baldwin make this point even better.
I would like to add someone to our group here. Professor Paul Weiss, a Sterling Professor of Philosophy at Yale. Were you able to listen to the show backstage?
I heard a good deal of it, but then I was behind the rostrum here.
Yes.
So I heard only some of it.
Did you hear anything that you disagreed with?
I disagreed with a great deal of it. And, of course, there's a good deal I agree with. But I think he's overlooking one very important matter, I think. Each one of us, I think, is terribly alone. He lives his own individual life. He has all kinds of obstacles in the way of religion or color or size or shape or lack of ability, and the problem is to become a man.
But what I was discussing was not that problem, really. I was discussing the difficulties, the obstacles, the very real danger of death thrown up by this society when a black man attempts to become a man.
All this emphasis upon black man and white does emphasize something which is here, but it emphasizes it or perhaps exaggerates it, and therefore makes us put people together in groups which they ought not to be in. I have more in common with a black scholar than I have with a white man who's against scholarship. And you have more in common with a white author than you have with someone who's against all literature. So why must we always concentrate on color or on religion or this? There are other ways of connecting men.
I'll tell you this. When I left this country in 1948, I left this country for one reason only, one reason. I didn't care where I went. I might have gone to Hong Kong, I might have gone to Timbuktu. I ended up in Paris, on the streets of Paris, with $40 in my pocket on the theory that nothing worse could happen to me there than had already happened to me here. You talk about making it as a writer by yourself. You have to be able then to turn up all the antenna with which you live, because once you turn your back on this society, you may die. You may die. And it's very hard to sit at a typewriter and concentrate on that if you're afraid of the world around you. The years I lived in Paris did one thing for me. They released me from that particular social terror, which was not the paranoia of my own mind, but a real social danger visible in the face of every cop, every boss, everybody. I don't know what most white people in this country feel, but I can only include what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know, as Malcolm X once put it, it's the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means that I can't afford to trust most white Christians, and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby is anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen.
I feel like this was 1968, but I feel like they were eavesdropping on our conversation today, or they read Hazel Marcus's 2024 paper, and then they were just discussing it, because that's how relevant this felt. I'm not sure where I am in my slides. Okay, here we go. But yeah, he captured so much. Actually, I want to be with you when you read that. He captured so much of just everything that I said. I mean, maybe if I do this again, I'll just say less and play this, because one thing that really stood out to me sort of when he first started talking, he was talking about sociocultural trauma. Like he was describing it. I could transcribe what he said and put that as my definition next to the SAMHSA definition. He's saying going to another country released me, like the language even. When you think about what trauma is and what healing from trauma requires, just going to another setting where these particular social structures were not relevant. So he was not cast, his identity was not a target. He was able to be a writer in that space, even with only $40 in his pocket and probably not speaking the language. So, and then he then goes through like how it structurally works. You know, he talked about all these different settings. A lot of that hasn't really changed, very sadly. It's really just such a great example. And his interlocutor, sorry for using that word, it just pops in my head, but the other guy, the Yale professor, whose name I don't remember, it was a perfect example of what people believe, like the well-intentioned, this is not even overtly racist point of view. It was well-intentioned, and I believe that he really believed the things that he was saying, but he couldn't understand it because his identity in this particular exchange and topic was not at risk. When you do the identity wheel, you realize, depending on the identities that are relevant to you, you're either in James Baldwin's seat or you're in Yale professor's seat. So it changes. In the other session that I was talking to you, that I shared with you that I do, we talk about that a little bit more extensively, like what's missing. And then that shows you where your sites of privilege are when you have an issue you don't think about. It means it's not showing up for you. You're in the Yale professor's seat with respect to that identity. So, oh, go ahead, Al.
I was just thinking about how, as we did the identity wheel, and right, for some of us, we can identify different areas of privilege. I just was remarking that we don't have any white men here in this room, nor do we often see white men in the room, when we have these types of workshops, which is really interesting because then we don't get to have like some really interesting conversations, or we don't get to see them saying, wow, let me acknowledge this, and I think that we all miss out when we don't get to have that experience, and yeah, just commenting.
Yeah, thank you for that point, because I feel like when we are talking about 10 services, exactly that, like once people need some kind of roadway. So some people are going to come because they're interested in the topic, but what if this showed up at your workplace in a format that you can use? Because we're getting we're playing with theory a little bit, but in a format that you can use and apply, so that people who don't look at a title and say that's for me still get the information and still get to have the enlightenment that comes with it. And I see Maisha has written, oh, Palo Alto is your hometown, and you can speak to it from personal experience. As a black and brown child attending a predominantly white school. I'm assuming you're saying that was you. And what does it look like for systems to check the box with attendance, but lack intentional change and inclusion? Yeah. So yeah, you're resonating on that on multiple levels and asking like the question, these are the questions, exactly what you wrote there. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. And we will we'll go on. I'm gonna have to edit myself a little bit. This will be a part 1 and part 2 next time. Okay, and so I want to talk about this individual versus structural, a very brief history of the concept of trauma. And I won't have years, but sometimes that's in my head, but I'm going to go super fast. In that, we started out talking about this, how the popular way currently of talking about trauma is thinking about it as an experience of the individual inside of their households, and not in these structural ways, like Maisha just spelled out as a perfect example. And the thing is, globally, that's not the case. There have been these conversations. In fact, in many parts of probably mostly the global South, people start there. When the concept of trauma began to expand, they started with genocide, war, displacement. They're like, yeah, trauma is a thing. And then there came around 2015, but before that, like maybe 2010-ish, no, even before that, like in the 2000s, where people started noticing that the Western and American conversation about trauma was like, why are they only talking about events that happen to people, individual people? Like, where's all this other stuff? Meanwhile, here in the States, people who have had like, who have studied um, race and culture and those kinds of issues also noticed it, but they have yet to see that those two conversations are happening together. So I see in the American context, people struggling and reckoning, like, this doesn't do it for me. Trauma is not just individual. And over here, there are these very deep conversations happening exactly about the fact that trauma is structural. So there's some work to do to bring those things together. And so I just brought a piece of that way of thinking. I just want to point out that it's not new. It's just, we can ask ourselves the question is, why aren't we having that conversation here when it was obvious elsewhere and has been happening? So, and then you can see right here, trauma theory continues to adhere to the traditional event-based model of trauma. I like that term, according to which trauma results from a single extraordinary catastrophic event. In numerous accounts, trauma is defined as a frightening event outside of ordinary experience, but this paradigm, I don't know how to say that, paradigmatic model of trauma does not necessarily work for non-Western and or minority group trauma, nor even for groups and individuals within Western societies. So it's just a perfect encapsulation of that conversation. And people are looking at the Western world like, what are you talking about? Like, why are you honing in on just this one singular dimension so hard? And so I'm not going to go through these, but I'm showing you two frameworks that I'm familiar with, and there's more of specifically American thinkers and panels who are trying to work through this. So this one's Wendy Ellis at George Washington University, who came up with this idea of the pair of aces, and now she's built some work around resilience that also addresses both the adverse childhood experiences, that individual level of trauma, and the roots, and name some of the things that can be the kind of the sociocultural components of trauma, but it's not necessarily an exhaustive list. So, and then we have something that might be exhaustive. It'll take you a long time to read through all of this if you haven't seen it before. But I like this RISE Center in Richmond, California. They do a lot of field building work, and in addition to working directly with youth who are in Richmond, California, which those youth are living in a community with a lot of different issues. So they've done in their field building work, they've done a lot of thinking about what they don't call it sociocultural trauma, but recognizing that trauma operates on these different levels. So individual and personal, yes, they include it, but there's also community in place. It's also systems and institutions, and it's also history, legacy, and structure. So they're having the conversation that those global scholars I mentioned are having, but what I haven't seen is those conversations intersecting. And so getting to some of the burdens of sociocultural trauma, people whose identities are targeted in some way or multiple ways have to live with a heightened awareness of their emotional, psychological, and physical vulnerability simply because they walk out of the house, or if sometimes their identity might not be known, but if they do something that makes it known, they will become targeted. If people just assume, like Allison was sharing, that they possess an identity, they may be, targeted with dislike, and I'm not gonna offer you experiences or friendship or things like that because of what I believe about you. and also the lived experience, because often like the Yale professor in the video is like, I have more in common. He was denying that the experience was occurring. I have more in common with a Black scholar than a white man who is against scholarship, as he put it. And so it's a denial. This isn't as big a deal as you're saying. We're just talking about it too much, thinking about it too much. But people have lived experience, and James Baldwin made that really clear, compellingly. Um, their experience with a sociocultural trauma can't be denied in that way. And then coming into settings like workplaces, coping with discrimination and microaggressions, isolation and exclusion from social connection, which is important, professional development and opportunities in the workplace. I kind of geared it more towards the workplace. And the burden of emotional labor, we don't have time to get into that. If you're familiar with it, you know exactly what I'm saying. So, but I'll give a brief explanation. So one thing that can happen when you have a targeted, an identity that's targeted by sociocultural trauma, and like I said, it's both historical and present. So one of the ways that it is present is being not only being given opportunities, but it's also being given the worst work, the hardest work, the most thankless work, the most unrewarded work. There's this other additional issue of what can be called emotive dissonance, which I think Twitter has picked up as code switching. Code switching is an old term, is a linguistic term, but people use that a lot. And emotive dissonance is another way of saying it. It's you have to, kind of perform an identity that's not your authentic identity. You can't bring your whole self to work because you feel that there'll be penalties if you do so. And you have the lived experience that tells you that that is likely. So one of the things that a workplace can do is be very intentional about creating an experience that is more just in several ways, and repetitively telegraphing that so that people begin to know that they're safe. Because you have to overcome, if in a workplace that's very serious about doing this work, you still have to overcome the past experiences. People aren't going to let go of things that they actually experienced until they do feel safe. And then I added, there's really clear evidence that sociocultural trauma is trauma, and not that it meets those definitions. And there was this concept of weathering that came about over 20 years ago, was sort of ignored at the time, probably because the focus of the topic was that Black women with a public health, I can show you, in a moment I'll show you, were experiencing what we now would call toxic stress, and we didn't quite have that term yet then. And they were experiencing it because of their identity status as Black women. So code switching, so this is a great discussion of it I just saw. And again, all of these sources are going to be on the reference slide. So the point here is code switching is that performance behavior. And I'll just switch to the highlighted piece where it says, you have to change your entire behavioral profile to successfully convince people that your code switching behaviors are in fact your natural behaviors. And this is incredibly demanding and physically exhausting. And we can see why we spend a lot of time at work. We spend the majority of our living years at work. So if you're having to do this all the time, this is a real problem for you in terms of your health and mental health. And this is there's a book, Weathering the Extraordinary Stress of Ordinary Life in an Unjust Society by Arlene Geronimus. And I won't spend a whole lot of time because I kind of just told you what weathering is about. And one thing that is not, I'll make sure is on here before you get it. I took that, this is the words are a snapshot of an NPR summary, and then they have a link of an interview with this author. So you might be interested in learning more that way. A 35-minute, I think, interview, or you could read the brief summary. This is just an excerpt of the brief summary. Okay. And then I think I'm okay. I'm actually okay with time. I was starting to panic. And so Shauna Murray Brown does she she does numerous things, but one of the things she does is lead an academy for counselors called Decolonizing or Therapy That Liberates is its name. And she also wrote, and this link is also in the references, a piece in a trade. It was a social work trade journal, Decolonizing Mental Health, the Healing Power of Community. And she talks about that she uses this liberation focused framework in her training. And what she takes the time to point out is that our time, it isn't your time management skills and it isn't your job. The truth is we inherited a system rooted in capitalism and commodity founded in oppression. Your lack of self-care, the absence of community care is because of North American culture. Put simply, to truly live a well life, our culture would have to change. Our values would have to shift. Love and spirit would have to be central. And one thing 10 Collective believes, maybe we won't, not we, but at the collective, we won't change the entire world in every workplace. But any workplace that wants to be intentional about this can change. We can create caring communities in the workplace. It doesn't, it's like I think everyone's heard of that parable of the starfish, where a man is, there's like thousands of starfish washed up on the beach and he's throwing them one by one, and someone's like, that's useless, it's just one by one. And he's like, it matters to the starfish that gets back into the water. And so I think that matters, and that aligns also with organizing thinking, like community organizing. Yes, you want to make a major change, a major shift, and say how we deal with the environment, but it also matters what you're doing on the local level, and that's a lot of times where you want to focus. And you can see the change. It doesn't. We don't have to wait until we feel like there's this moment for the whole thing to change, or else we won't participate in change work at all. So we can think of workplaces that way as well. And we can also use that as an assessment of where we are willing to work and where we are not willing to work. Do I have time for my favorite? I'll come back to it if because I want to make sure there's nothing I'm leaving out. This is just a nod to the earlier point. I like the way she says it about the limitations of the individual trauma theory. Now, I don't think she's aware that there is trauma theory is much bigger. It's just in Western and American context. She's in Kentucky, where it's leaving out the justice element. So this is exactly what I'm talking about. Like there's these conversations. Some people get that there's something missing, but they don't know there's a whole other conversation. But that's not for now. And then we have, so workplace, starting to think about even more specifically how this works out in the, this impacts the workplace setting. So whether we like it or not, we are assigning different value to who is more worthy and competent based on their identity group membership. When they walk in, people walk in, it can be age. I just was hearing someone talk about that, how they do a very serious job. They do some investigative work. And when they walk in the room, people just automatically give them less respect because they are relatively young, but they're one of those people who looks even younger. Like if they were in a high school, people might think they were a high school student. And so they have to work a lot harder to get people's attention and respect. We're doing this all the time on all of the identities on the identity wheel, plus whatever's missing. So we place more unwanted and less rewarded work assignments and opportunities on people whose identities we devalue. So if we can't acknowledge that we devalue, then we're not going to do anything about it. And then we're going to perpetuate that cycle. We deny that we're favoring and disfavoring employees based on identity status, despite overwhelming research evidence to the contrary. And by overwhelming, I mean overwhelming. Like there's several sections of sociology that are devoted to this topic. Like when people refute this based on their opinion, I'm just always like, oh my gosh, there's like thousands, I don't know, millions. And there's so much research on this. It's not really refutable. And okay, we're getting towards the end, and I see Allison leaving opportunities to further join Tend, and I have a card on that too. So I won't even read this, but the idea is, like I said before, we can create specific workplaces that are different. Just because we don't think we can do every single corporate workplace, doesn't mean that, and with the right people creating intention, we can't make a shift. And so I kind of set here, and you'll get the slides, some big ideas about how that shifts, and then a little bit more specific. But where a lot of these will hit at policy, the kind of how we do our mission and vision. And one thing that Tend wants to work on is keeping these agreements from being symbolic only, because that is a lot of what has happened in the past few years, where people kind of woke up to, oh, we need to do something, but then it became very symbolic and paper thin, really. So, and it doesn't have to be that way. And a lot of that has to do with getting concrete and having an accountability and review process, so you can, and metrics, so you can determine if you are doing the things that you set out to do. And so creating caring, equity-centered communities at work, we can make that intentional shift. We have to acknowledge so that we can then do that work of creating. And this is what I wanted to get to before we ended. So you can think of it as de-triggering sociocultural trauma in your workplace. And so for those who want to work with Tend, we can include, as part of your package, educational sessions. There's more that I have to say about that, because people do need to know history a little bit. Some people are starting with zero information. I kind of started with an assumption. I didn't even say it. Everybody knows that there's racism and discrimination. I didn't even start with, there's people who, they don't know that. So we can include that in a very affirming way, not non-shaming, affirming way, to get people to the point of knowledge. And then what do we do to kind of take accountability, responsibility for shifting? And we can, reach out, and I think Allison probably put that in the chat, but how to reach out if you want to know more. And a reminder of the services that Tend offers. This will be in the slides if you want to take a little bit closer look. And these are our goals to help the kinds of issues we want to help you address, so that you can create caring community at work. And I had this in here. I know Allison follow the information in Allison's chat, because I put these in kind of without consultation first. And the job grief support group as well. But this book club, do you want to say just a quick word? Because we got 2 minutes about the book club. I think the date might have changed, but just about what it's about.
Yeah, we may end up pushing it back a month just to make sure we get a bunch of people for Darsha, because she's amazing. And this book is incredible. It's listing a lot of the typical precepts for our white dominated society, including like hierarchical structures and money over people and these sorts of things. And then there's a chapter about each precept, interviewing and talking with an Indigenous people from all over the world, and how Indigenous wisdom and knowledge can help us overcome these really harmful precepts in our worldview. So it's going to be a really incredible event.
Okay. All right. And so, yeah, we hope to see you at that event and others. And always reach out if you're interested in working with us more